Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's press conference about the Oakland Institute's new report, The Great Carbon Boondoggle, Inside the Struggle to Stop Summit's CO2 Pipeline. My name is Andy Currier. I'm a research associate at the Institute and co-author of the report. So this is a big week to determine the future role of carbon capture and storage. COP27 is underway in Egypt, where global leaders are discussing how to address the rapidly escalating climate crisis. CCS is being aggressively promoted as a key mitigation tactic. In the US, CCS is receiving massive public funding and bipartisan political support. And as we speak, the National Carbon Capture Conference has just kicked off in Des Moines, Iowa. We have seen powerful corporations successfully hijack these major forums and push solutions that they profiteer from. Today, we amplify the voices calling CCS out for what it is: a dangerous false climate solution that threatens communities, the health of our land, air, and water, while enriching the very same fossil fuel and ethanol industry players responsible for the current climate crisis. You'll hear more from experts firsthand. Before that, I'm going to give a quick overview of the report. Now, there are currently 3 major carbon pipelines being proposed in the Midwestern United States. Our report focuses on the largest of these, Iowa-based Summit Carbon Solutions Midwest Carbon Express. The pipeline will run approximately 2,000 miles across Iowa before expanding to Minnesota, Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota. The $4.5 billion project claims it will capture emissions from partner bioethanol plants and transport it to supposedly be safely stored underground in North Dakota. Summit claims the project will capture 12 million tons of carbon dioxide annually while bolstering the ethanol industry and creating jobs. Despite these lofty claims, a diverse coalition of Indigenous organizations, farmers, and environmentalists have banded together to stop the project. Now, the report provides the answer to the question, why, given this widespread opposition and evidence that carbon capture and storage is a false climate solution, the project continues to move forward. Exposing Summit's web of political connections and powerful financial investors provides illuminating answers that you'll hear more about shortly. We first looked into this project after learning about the leading role played by agribusiness baron Bruce Rastetter. The Oakland Institute first came across Rastetter back in 2011 as he tried to pull off what would have been the largest land deal in Tanzania. Exposing his attempted land grab and the massive displacement it would have caused revealed that for Rastetter, profits came before the public good. The Institute's April 2022 report debunked the benefits of the project, and this new follow-up details the David versus Goliath struggle that is unfolding in Iowa. Now, our report is titled The Great Carbon Boondoggle. Maybe it's because I'm not from the Midwest. It could be a generational thing as well, but I was not familiar with this word, boondoggle, until I spoke with a woman landowner who refused Summit's offer. Now, she used boondoggle to describe the project. After I looked it up, I learned that it means a worthless activity that is wasteful and pointless, but gives the appearance of having value. After reading the report and hearing from the experts today, it'll be hard to find a better word to describe this project. I'd now like to introduce Mahmoud Fatil, Frontlines Action Coordinator for Great Plains Action Society. Thanks for being here, Mahmoud. Now, while it hasn't gotten as much media coverage as it should, why are Indigenous communities resisting this project?
Well, there are a number of reasons, Andy. Thank you for inviting us and giving us a chance to speak here on the platform. Doing our work with Great Plains Action Society, we're engaging a lot of the local tribes, the way that, manifest destiny and the history of colonialism has unfolded in this nation. Many of those tribes find themselves aligned along the Missouri River, which is the natural border of the western portion of Iowa, between Nebraska and Iowa. A number of reasons the Indigenous communities are upset and concerned for these projects, particularly the bad taste left in their mouth after recent projects such as, the 10-year-long odyssey of fighting KXL, the Line 3 recent situation up in Minnesota, as well as right here in Iowa, the struggle against Apple that really ran roughshod over a lot of the people, both the majority population of Americans as well as the Indigenous communities, by not properly informing them and getting proper consent and working with the communities to ensure proper health goals and safeties were ensured to those communities. Same situation here. There's a big concern for transient workforce coming through with a lot of people from out of state that have no ties to the community. It's been documented through research that there's a grave risk to Indigenous women in particular, as well as children, boys, for human trafficking during these activities. Recently, during the Line 3 project up in Minnesota, there was a sex trafficking sting, and several Enbridge employees were involved in that. Right here in Iowa, we, during a direct action in DAPL, had a young Indigenous woman who was solicited. An employee, as he was driving off the work site, stated, "How much for the little girl?" You know, that's offensive on many reasons, but it's a long history of that going on in the United States, and it just continually being perpetuated by the fossil fuel industry. Once we commodify the earth, we begin commodifying people as well. So that's a big issue. Primarily safety. These are much different than the traditional petroleum pipelines. They're known to be explosive. They have ductile fractures. There was an incident down in Satarsha, and zero communication has been given to the tribes. Many of the tribes, such as the Omaha Nation and the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, their reservations lie right along the path. Like literally, as the pipe goes from Iowa across the Missouri into Nebraska, the pipe runs almost parallel to the border of the Winnebago reservation. And this is concerning. Reservations have limited resources like many of the rural communities. There's often auxiliary or volunteer fire departments and emergency response personnel. And these people are not being engaged properly by the company to explain what's going on. Summit in particular is brand new at the pipeline game. They have never made a pipeline before. And so Indigenous communities are once again finding themselves being guinea pigs or trial subjects for something that's unproven, unsafe, and in many of our minds unsound as a climate solution or a tactic to reverse the climate emergency and address it. It certainly isn't what Iowans deserve or the future generations, and particularly the Indigenous sovereign nations that are not being consulted along the route currently.
Right, thank you. I think what you raised about, you know, this link between commodifying the earth and then leading to commodifying people is very powerful and a huge issue, especially given all the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives that have been associated with these projects in the past. And the report looks at those concerns a little bit more as well. And I know Great Plains Action Society has a lot of information on that on your website too. So encourage anyone to take a look there. Well, thank you, Mahmoud. We'll now hear from Jessica Mazur, Conservation Program Coordinator for the Sierra Club Iowa chapter. Jessica has played a major role in organizing landowners and providing them with the necessary resources to understand this project. Jessica, can you tell us why this is a false climate solution and the actual risk the pipeline will have if it's built?
Yeah, thank you so much, Andy. Thank you, Oakland Institute, for putting this report together. These carbon pipeline companies promote their projects as addressing climate change and as being crucial to the survival and success of the ethanol industry, and we dispute those claims. In order to reach our climate change goals, we have to have significant reductions in emissions of greenhouse gases. And just capturing CO2 or other greenhouse gases while the source keeps emitting them will not solve the problem. So essentially, carbon capture just enables the continuation of business as usual and prolongs our reliance on fossil fuels. The latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change identified carbon capture as one of the highest cost, lowest mitigation potential options for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Wind and solar energy and carbon sequestration in agriculture were far more effective. And ADM, a company that was Navigator's main customer and is now Wolf's main customer, has admitted that carbon capture is the least effective means to reduce its carbon footprint and that the vast majority of its carbon emissions come from its coal-fired power plant. We also don't know what these companies are going to do with the CO2 once it gets to its destination. Summit has already made statements the CO2 will be used for enhanced oil recovery. Navigator has said it has no control over what's done with the CO2. And Wolf has said the CO2 will just be buried, but ADM, their main customer, has said that they have plans for it to be used for enhanced oil recovery. The bottom line is we have to phase out fossil fuels, specifically regarding the ethanol and fertilizer plants involved in these projects. They're only taking away CO2 from the fermentation process, not the main source of the CO2 from the plants, the coal or gas-fired sources that power the plant, and the machinery that actually captures the CO2. Furthermore, studies have shown that these increased greenhouse gas emissions from ag practices used to grow the corn for ethanol likely contribute to climate change, counteracting any alleged benefit from carbon capture from ethanol plants. And the ethanol industry itself does very little to move us away from fossil fuels. Instead, it keeps the fossil fuel industry alive. The US is moving away from oil in spite of the efforts by oil and ethanol industries. Some states are incentivizing electric vehicles, and auto companies are responding to consumer demand and setting deadlines for having an all electric product line. And Jim's going to tell you a lot more about this, but the very business model for these pipelines raises concerns. These companies are relying on the 45Q federal tax credit, which is supposed to be used to promote real climate solutions. So a pipeline company can claim a huge tax break at the taxpayer's expense for a project that we have seen has little effect on reducing climate change. I mean, we have a looming climate crisis in front of us. We need to act now, and we need to spend our time and resources on known climate solutions, not on CCS carbon pipeline boondoggles. Frontline communities across the planet who are experiencing the devastation of climate firsthand, they need us to act today here in the Midwest to make sure that these billions of dollars aren't wasted and stolen by the very industries that have contributed to our climate crisis. And it's not just threatening the chance of us being able to mitigate climate change. It destroys our land in the process. It's dangerous, as Mahmoud mentioned. It's going to set bad precedent that private companies can take land for profits that's not in the public use. There are so many things that are wrong with these projects that it's really important that we have to continue to stand together against Summit, Navigator, and Wolf carbon pipelines, because we're not going to beat them alone, but we will beat them if we stand together.
Well, thank you, Jess. I think a lot of good information there, but what really stuck out to me is the highest cost and lowest mitigation potential. That's pretty straightforward in that this is not the most efficient use of resources. So thank you for explaining that. We'll come back with some more questions shortly. Next up, we have Jim Walsh, Policy Director for Food and Water Watch. And as Jessica mentioned, Jim, can you speak a bit to how billions in federal incentives are supporting these projects?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. And thank you so much for having me. I'm Jim Walsh. I'm the Policy Director for Food and Water Watch. And Food and Water Watch mobilizes communities to tackle the most pressing issues facing access to safe, clean drinking water and healthy, sustainable food and our climate. And we've been working on CCS for a number of years, really due to the tremendous adverse impacts that CCS will have on each of these areas. And today I'm going to talk about the history of public handouts to corporate interests that are pushing carbon capture. But first, I want to be very clear. Carbon capture is a dirty and expensive boondoggle that will not be profitable without massive federal funding. Being profitable does not mean it's effective as a tool for addressing the climate crisis. In fact, it's really an unsafe distraction from real reforms that we need to rein in the fossil fuel and big ag interests, who are the main drivers of climate change and are simultaneously destroying our communities, poisoning our water and air, and raking in record profits. The funding for CCS aptly started in 1984, when the federal government started funding clean coal programs, newspeak that I'm sure would make George Orwell blush. Between 1984 and 1990, we saw our government invest over $2.6 billion in carbon capture through these programs, starting a legacy of carbon capture failures. A few years later, the federal government and the coal industry announced a plan to spend an additional $1 billion of public money on what would become a failed carbon capture demonstration project at a coal plant in Illinois. The General Accounting Office and the Inspector General actually investigated the federal funding of these projects and documented significant waste and abuse of federal public money, with over $1 billion in credits not providing any proof of actual CO2 storage, and almost $500 million spent on projects that were never built. And only 2 of 9 funded projects at the end of this funding cycle that I previously discussed were actually operational. And most notably, the GAO study report says absent any congressional mechanisms to provide greater oversight and accountability, such as requiring regular DOE reporting on project status and funding, DOE may risk expediting significant taxpayer funds on CCS demonstrations that have little likelihood of success. So Congress obviously would take that up and make those changes, right? Well, they didn't. Instead, what they did was double down on these tax credits. And they created, perhaps what's the most significant development for CCS, was really the creation of 45Q in 2008. And 45Q refers to a section of our tax code that provides production tax credits for capturing carbon dioxide. When originally rolled out, the rates a corporation could receive for capturing a ton of CO2 was $10 to $20 per ton, depending on if they would use it for oil production or for what they call permanent storage. But in reality, and it also had a program, the program was capped at 75 million tons of CO2. And almost all the CO2 that was captured initially and continues to be true to this day was used to increase oil production by injecting CO2 into old oil wells to extract otherwise unrecoverable oil. And despite receiving nearly $10 billion in public money, the industry was still floundering and unprofitable. In 2010, the federal government stuck another $3 billion into carbon capture with the passage of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. But compared to what we're seeing today, these corporate handouts were a mere drop in the ocean of carbon capture funding that's been allocated by the federal government. In 2018, Congress updated 45Q to offer a $35 per ton for carbon used in enhanced oil recovery, or $50 per ton for geological storage, rather than the $10 or $20 respectively when the program was initially rolled out a decade earlier. In 2020, another $6 billion was put on the table specifically for investment in carbon capture infrastructure. And last year, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act allocated a whopping $15 billion to further expand carbon capture infrastructure research and demonstration projects. And finally, in 2022, when Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, they again updated the 45Q tax credit to change it to a direct pay system and increase the subsidies available for carbon capture projects under 45Q by up to 70%. And the direct pay option really allows corporations that don't pay taxes to still claim these, to reap the benefits of these public handouts. And the 3 carbon capture pipeline projects that are slated for Iowa alone are eligible for $40 billion in federal subsidies. And for the industry that's never succeeded in any of the goals they put forward, the research and demonstration projects that have occurred have shown us one thing over and over and over again: carbon capture doesn't work. Well, unless you define working as making a profit, then it will probably start working just fine for the big oil and ag interests that are pushing this garbage on our communities. And these corporate giveaways of our public tax dollars explain why we've seen the sudden interest in expanding an otherwise failing carbon capture industry. Despite what they'd like you to think, the oil and ethanol industries didn't wake up one day and decide, oh, we care about the climate crisis. CCS is not about capturing carbon, it's about capturing our tax dollars. Rather than investing in resources that would benefit the lives and well-being of everyday people, the federal government is shoveling public money into the pocketbooks of powerful corporations and wealthy investors. This is a type of grift that must be stopped. Our tax dollars are meant to be used for the public good, not for private corporations to seize our land, endanger our communities, public safety, and profit by pushing this false climate solution. We will not be forced to burden the many risks of these pipelines while a couple of fat cats and their cronies make off with the reward. Our land, our lives are not for sale. Thank you so much for having us here today.
Well, thank you, Jim. I think, you said it really clearly. It's not about capturing carbon, but about our tax dollars. And now, so Frederick Mousseau, Policy Director at the Oakland Institute, is going to talk a little bit more about who will be capturing those tax dollars. So Frederick, can you tell us a bit about the investors behind Summit's project? and how their connections, political connections, keep the project alive despite resistance?
Yes, thank you, Andy. Yeah, it's actually perfect that I come here because Jim's presentation was very clear. This is about a number of interest profiteering, and it starts with Bruce Rastetter, who is behind the project. The one at the origin of the project is a millionaire from Iowa. He is known as a Republican kingmaker. He's the CEO of a group called Summit Agricultural Group, which has made a fortune in agribusiness, ethanol, and oil production. And we know his group is invested. We don't know how much. We know from from Rastetter that he has raised already $1.1 billion from different investors in this project. This includes some powerful financial interests. So to name those, we know there's TPG, Rice Climate Fund, Continental Resources, Inc., Tiger Infrastructure Partners, as well as a South Korean firm, SKENS, and also Deere & Company, for which we don't know how much they have invested. For those we know, it's a total of $760 million invested from these different investors I've just mentioned. And interestingly, Summit has refused to disclose the identity of the other investors who to reach this 1.1 billion that has been announced. So this is highly problematic given the major environmental and human risk of such project, also given the billions of taxpayer money going into the project that we don't even know a number of the investors and who is going to benefit from this. So it really raises a critical question of accountability in the use of public money, and also if tomorrow there's a problem, if there's a rupture, if there's a disaster, who is going to be held accountable for that? That's a real question that we raise in the report. In any case, when you look at the non-investors, our research has found that several of them have a history of failed ventures, bankruptcies. A number of them have record of illicit financial conduct. Just told us about this windfall of tax credits. At the time the administration is going to sign checks with 8 or 9 zeros, these bad records should be really legitimate concerns for the public, for everyone. It is remarkable, as also Jim said, that as seen in the case of Bruce Rastetter himself, they have failed projects in the past, but it doesn't mean they were not profitable for them. And we know Bruce Rastetter has managed to grow a considerable fortune over time, despite this history of bankruptcy and failed projects. So that's another big concern that we raise. Another important finding is that many of these investors have deep ties to the fossil fuel industry. Most of them are backed by BlackRock and Vanguard Group, two firms that have and continue to play a major role in fueling the climate crisis. They remain highly invested in fossil fuel and keep expanding projects despite the urgency to act. CCS clearly represents a lifeline for oil and gas companies and their investors. At the time the world should be ending its reliance on fossil fuels, these CCS projects enable them to continue extraction. It really masks the emissions by artificially reducing the numbers, but they keep operating and extracting, and they're gonna do even more. Instead of closing down their operations, they're going to extract more. And what we know also about CCS is that there's a big potential that some of these projects are used with enhanced oil recovery, this famous EOR, to do actually some sort of fracking to extract more and to take whatever oil remains in wells. And they're going to receive tax credits for that, which is again, as Jess said, quite shocking. Lastly, we highlight in our report some disturbing political connections related to political financing. John Deere, Bruce Rastetter have both made political contributions to the campaigns of the present and past governors of Iowa, Branstad and Reynolds. We know Reynolds, as the governor of Iowa, plays a key role in driving CCS projects. In 2021, She signed an executive order launching a task force to promote carbon sequestration and the CCS projects. We also know, and it is disturbing too, that governors of those who have appointed the 3 members of the Iowa Utilities Board. And we explained in the report that the company has failed so far to obtain voluntary easements for the lands they need to build the pipeline from the landowners. And the Iowa Utilities Board will ultimately decide whether to grant eminent domain for Summit to take land from the people in Iowa. And so these 3 members of the IUB are going to have to make this important decision, while all of them have been appointed by governors who got finance in their campaigns by the investors and the key person behind the project. It's interesting when you look at their website. The stated mission of the Iowa Utilities Board is to, I quote, regulate utilities to ensure that reasonably priced, reliable, and environmentally responsible and safe utility services are available to all Iowans, closing the quote. So it's highly questionable for what we've heard today, that these pipelines and CCS will provide such services to the residents of the state. Another significant political connection that we unveil is around the Vilsack family. Jess Vilsack, Summit's general counsel, is the son of Tom Vilsack, the current Ag Secretary and former Iowa governor. Either as governor or as Secretary of Agriculture, Vilsack has spent all his political career pushing for the ethanol-friendly policies Summit stands to benefit from. Under Vilsack, as we've heard, the federal government has significantly expanded its support for the ethanol industry in recent years, whether in terms of regulations or direct financial support. So we've seen ethanol consumption really booming in the US over the past 20 years. It has from 1.65 billion gallons in 2000. It was nearly 14 billion gallons in 2021. So it's nearly a tenfold increase over the past 20 years. And what we see with this recent federal assistance is what we can foresee is just going to increase even more. But given ethanol is actually even more carbon emitting than gasoline, the only way they can continue to push this industry and to support this industry is ensuring it produces less emissions. This is the one rationale of storing CO2, is ensuring the industry can continue to expand. So to conclude, with the climate crisis we are facing, we should be decarbonizing the economy through renewable energy, cutting down emissions from agriculture, industry, and transport. And we see here with this convergence of these 2 groups of interest from the fossil fuel and the ethanol industry, we see just the opposite is happening. Instead of decarbonizing, what we see with CCS is that it enables shareholders, investors in the oil and gas sector to safeguard trillions of dollars of profit and continue business as usual. We really need to stop them. I'll stop there. There's much more in the report, and I encourage you to read and share. I don't know if, Andy, you're able to share this one slide. I can try to share my screen, but it was not working earlier. Let me see if it works. No, I can't share my screen.
Yeah, I can share with the investor or
the one page 11. I think we have 2 very interesting charts in the report that really highlight both who are the investors and the political connections, and what I've just explained about. We don't see. You can see otherwise at the top of our chat we have the link of the report, and page 11 of the report you'll have this chart describing these political connections, and it's really telling. It's even hard to believe. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today. Be happy to discuss further.
Thanks, Frederick. Yeah, so as Frederick mentioned, the charts are in the report detailing Summit's investors as well as the political connections. Now that includes political connections to the IUB, who will ultimately decide if eminent domain is used to seize land from farmers. And again, this is the IUB did grant the Dakota Access Pipeline the power to use eminent domain. So this is something, despite its unpopularity, despite questionable benefits for the state, the board has acted, against those interests in the past. Before we move to questions, I had just a few quick things we wanted to say, to share that after interviewing certain farmers in Iowa, they shared with me. I just want to touch on those really briefly. Farmers who are facing eminent domain, and they shared, what this would mean for them, what their experiences with Summit were, and what the impact of the project would have on their families. One farmer explained his experience over the last year was nothing short of elder abuse, domestic terrorism, and psychological warfare after Summit repeatedly tried to have his parents sign over land on their 5th-generation farm. Now, farmers are rightfully concerned over the impact the pipeline will have on their farms. Summit claims that they'll repair any damages, but the farmers are the ones who know exactly how much effort went into constructing drainage tile or building terraces, and they'll not put the future health of their land in the hands of the company. What really came through in these interviews with farmers is that despite what the company is promising, they shared that for them, they felt Summit had little respect for the land or families who call Iowa home. Now, the report has more in-depth quotes from these landowners as well, so you can kind of see how big of a deal this is for them. So with that, we'll move over to the question and answer portion. We got a few here already. I'll start with one for Mahmoud. So as someone familiar with the consultation Summit had with the Winnebago tribe, did you feel that the perspective of the tribe was actually taken into consideration? And did it actually influence the plans of Summit?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question, Andy. The Winnebago tribe was never really engaged in the same manner. Neither were the Omaha tribe, the Santee, the Yankton, or any of the other tribes along the route in the tri-state area that we're working with here in South Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa throughout the Great Plains. We saw that they were in a mad rush to kind of put their information/propaganda sessions out to the public and kind of spoon feed everybody all the benefits and why the projects need to be answered. And we started reaching out to the THPOs, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers of each of the tribal nations that find themselves along the Missouri, which subsequently is a major portion of the route as it traverses from Iowa into the Greater Plains region. And we were able to secure finally an informational session and tribal meeting with Summit folks. And they do actually have a tribal liaison who attended the meeting, but oddly enough, did not speak very much. Chris Hill, the main person who speaks during the informational sessions, did most of the talking. They provided us a map, the Summit project map that was published out by EXP, and it included the tribal nations, the sovereign nations along the route. However, they were just grayed in areas, and they were not denotated by any type of name or anything like that. During that meeting, we asked a very simple question because it seemed like the concerns of tribal members didn't really matter. They just tailored the same speech that they had been giving around Iowa to other communities and threw in some things that they thought would be attractive to Native Americans, like, hey, we're going to have jobs available for you and things like that, which we all know from previous experiences. Initially when there's a build out, there will be thousands of jobs, but those workers will be brought into state from other areas. It's not going to benefit the local economy. In the end, it'll probably be a couple dozen people that have jobs, if that. And so they always like to play the jobs numbers and use the unions out there. But the reality of it is it's a lot more risk than it is any type of reward for the tribal communities. And they felt very upset that they were last in line to be consulted. As sovereign tribal nations, the treaty is the supreme law of the United States. And they do need to be consulted regarding projects that are in or on their historic tribal lands, cultural areas. And these projects, both Summit and Navigator, traverse the Missouri River, skirting right along the edge of the Winnebago Nation. During that meeting, we asked them on their own map to identify where the Winnebago Nation of Nebraska was located, the reservation, and they had no idea. between the 5 representatives that were on the meeting, including their tribal liaison, Aaron, they had no idea where the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska's reservation is, which is the closest reservation to the actual project. Both tribes, Omaha and Winnebago, have land on both sides of the river in Nebraska and Iowa. And the Omaha are now trying to figure out as well. We're having consultations with their THPOs and their tribal representatives. We attended a council meeting and we spoke with the councilwoman of the Winnebago tribe, which ultimately led to the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska pushing back a bit and requesting an environmental impact study. As many of you may or may not know, most things that deal with Native Americans in this nation are handled at a federal level and not a state level. And it creates kind of an interesting situation when we have projects like this that are approved at a state by state level. And then how do we interact with the sovereign nations? So it's important for NGOs like Great Plains Action Society to engage those nations to make sure they're properly informed of the risks of potential or proposed benefits by the companies, and to kind of give them an idea of what's actually going on. Native Americans maintain a spirituality that's largely based and rooted in nature. They're very concerned about the environment. As we all know, the legacy of this country was built on stolen land. Even if it's off reservation, there are important cultural and historic sites to these peoples, and they don't want to see the land tore up and desecrated any more than it's already been, just like their neighbors off reservation in the rural communities. As such, they're also concerned about safety, as we had mentioned. This pipeline has had a groundswell of grassroots opposition, bipartisan. We had a bill produced and introduced in the Iowa State Legislature, a floor bill by Senator Taylor, who happens to be a conservative Republican, and it was tabled ultimately, despite the widespread bipartisan opposition, because the Governor Reynolds did not want it to go through. That's a demonstration of the state power coming in and forcing the agenda down on the people who don't necessarily have a voice and find themselves in the way of these projects. Another situation was back when DAPL was being proposed. Bruce Rastetter had 2 people removed from the IUB and replaced by people that would approve the project, ensuring DAPL got permitted through the IUB. So that's ways that the political influence is taking hold on this, the states' rights versus tribal rights and the federal concerns. And as the project progresses, I'm sure that they're going to try to court the tribes a bit more. But so far, the tribes are not impressed. They have not had any free, prior, or informed consent. They don't see these actors as good actors or good neighbors moving into the community. They're well aware from DAPL, Keystone XL projects proposed of the risks associated with transient worker camps, and particularly amongst Native Americans. The city of Omaha is number 7 in the United States for missing and murdered Indigenous women. The state of Nebraska has the unfortunate designation of being number 8 in the United States for missing and murdered relatives. And in the state of Nebraska, unfortunately, it's men who or boys, males, under the age of, I believe, 13, who comprise the largest amount of people in the MMIR epidemic. So it is a real concern, besides the obvious physical safety concerns of having a high pressure hazardous waste pipeline come through. Another concern I mentioned was, tribal governments handle things at a federal level. And as we've all been made aware of, maybe a week or 2 ago, PHMSA, the Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Association, they have no regulations set up yet for CO2. And we've got these companies at a mad dash trying to capture these taxpayer dollars when we don't have proper regulations set up. And to us and to the tribal nations, that's unacceptable. That's, violation of the bad man clause and other things that they've got going on with the United States government. So the IUB went ahead and dismissed the Winnebago's call for an environmental impact study, just as they had done when the tribe called for an environmental impact study back during DAPL's build out. And the tribe remained resolute in their opposition, and they ultimately supported quite a bit the opposition as it unfolded locally in Iowa, Nebraska, and then up at Standing Rock against DAPL. So the community is against it for obvious reasons. They're very concerned about the land and the historic cultural ties to that land. That's, the key to Indigenous people is tying to the land. And they feel as though that they're just not being really taken considered equals or being taken as a priority amongst the companies thus far. And as we've seen, it's sort of bought and paid for. The IUB clearly dismissed their claims, and they've vowed to continue in opposition, and they'll probably take it further to the federal level if it goes further in the permitting process. But these are concerns for sure amongst the community. Emergency response, the MMIR epidemic, concerns of desecration to the land, continued ecological destruction through monocropping and GMO production of corn for this ethanol, which will be locked in. These are all very big concerns, and these are concerns that we all share. We're all Iowans in a way, we're all Nebraskans in a way. These are all our communities, and we need to be safe, and we need to care about the land and our future generations.
Thank you, Mahmoud. I think that's really clear then how, any claim Summit has that they've been working closely with tribes to design this project are just kind of PR spin on their website and not rooted in any sort of reality. Well, thank you. We have a question from the audience here for Jim. Given the collusion between financial and political interests in Iowa, what can be done to challenge this false climate solution at the national level?
Thank you very much for that question. We've seen recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act is touted by it's a huge success by many because it provides a lot of federal funding for clean energy infrastructure, which is important, but building clean energy infrastructure is not going to address the climate crisis if we continue to expand CCS and other fossil fuel infrastructure. Quite frankly, the planet doesn't care how much clean energy we build, only that we stop emissions from the fossil fuel industry and big agricultural interest. And CCS extends a lifeline to these dirty energy sources, really allowing them to greenwash themselves with technology that's ineffective while continuing to expand drilling and fossil fuel infrastructure. And we're now seeing, with all of this federal money going out the door, the discussion in Capitol Hill now is centered on what's so-called permitting reform. And this, so-called permitting reform was pushed by Senator Manchin and is really a giveaway to the fossil fuel industry and the carbon capture industry. These permitting reform rules are actually a plan to fast track fossil fuel infrastructure, including carbon capture development. And so right now, one of the critical fights in the country is to make sure that that legislation does not pass sometime between now and the end of the year, because that permitting reform legislation will really remove some of the last lines of defense that communities have to protect themselves from the fossil fuel industry and to protect themselves from the onslaught of discussion or destruction that's been brought forward on communities from other projects and working to address those sorts of things. And so I think that it's really important to think about the fact that the industry could receive literally between 283 and $401 billion a year on resources for carbon capture if they utilize, depending on how they utilize the resources. And this would be capturing all the emissions across the United States. But this is literally an unlimited subsidy with very little, if any, public oversight. And so this fossil fuel fast track bill that Senator Manchin has been pushing will undermine any ability of communities to actually stop these projects from adversely impacting air and water and our climate. And so as residents and community members in the United States, I think one of the biggest things we need to do is to repeal all of this federal funding. That should be this is the only reason we're seeing this massive rush of dozens of fossil fuel projects under the guise of CCS being pushed forward. But we also need to make sure that this permitting reform bill does not pass, because this will really result in a massive fast tracking of these projects across the country, under the guise of addressing the climate crisis, while we're wasting precious resources that could actually be used on real solutions to address the climate crisis.
Well said, Jim. Thank you. Our next question is for Jessica. So what about the resistance to the pipeline so far gives you hope that, despite the company's financial resources and their political connections, the project can still be stopped? And maybe you can speak more to the local level after hearing Jim speak to the national level.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think one of the big things that gives me hope is there's more of us than them. People from all walks of life, from every corner of the state and every state that's impacted, people are standing up and saying no, whether they're people that just live nearby, neighbors in small communities, directly impacted landowners, Indigenous communities, environmentalists, local governments, and lots of different entities all across the state are standing up and saying no. So that gives me the most hope, is because, for Iowa specifically, the only other pipeline of this magnitude that we've seen come through our state was Dakota Access. And they did not do a very good job of earning goodwill and setting, a good example of what the pipeline industry coming into state means. And we saw lots of destruction of the land, permanent destruction. And we saw bad precedent set for eminent domain. And we saw, the man camps, and we saw them offering money for little girls. Like, we now know what this comes with. And we now know that the lies that they tell, that they're going to keep our community safe and they're going to protect our land and all that, it's just PR, it's just statements. So what gives me hope is that, you fool us once, shame on us, fool us twice, or shame on you, fool us twice, shame on us. And we figured that out. So the fact that we're standing up together and saying no, and getting so many important entities along for the ride, say no, 44 out of 56 counties have formally objected here in the state. We have 15 towns and cities. We've got Board of Health. We've got Chamber of Commerces that are saying no. I think it's just, that's what gives me hope, is despite how much money they have, we are the ones that get to decide our future here in our state and the other impacted states. And we're loudly standing together and saying, absolutely not.
That's great. And I think agreed that it is, despite the odds, it is something to be proud of and to keep working towards. Frederick, did you have a word to add on that?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think it's great what just said. It's we must realize the power of the people, and we can be legitimately concerned by all these connections and high connections and the power of some of the individuals and corporations behind the project. But when you see the efforts they develop in terms of PR, it shows by itself that they have some concerns and they want to curb the opposition. And so when you see them co-opting some indigenous name, or when you see them like boasting about the tax revenues that are going to come to as a result of the project, it does show that they need to build some legitimacy and to be accepted. And something we do in the report is we compare this 317 million that they boast as bringing as new tax revenue. We compare this to what we just heard, the billions they're going to make every year in tax credits. So there's a lot of lies, and I think it's important that we go after these lies and we do what we are doing all together, sharing the information, deconstructing what they are saying, and we, as just said, we have to realize the power people have and the power also of the truth and the facts that are there. So we need to oppose science and facts to all the PR and lies they are putting forward.
Thank you, Frederick. I wanted to just check if anyone had a final word to add, if they wanted to speak, touch on anything else before we conclude. All right.
One thing I'll just add, given the opportunity, is, this is going on in chat here, and I'm not sure if who's able to see it. It looks like it's between the host and panels, but I want to point out that the storage of carbon CO2 poses significant risk to public health and the environment. And this ranges from uncontrollable leaks to creating what are really new sources of radioactive waste from brine extraction at CO2 injection wells. And, this industry pretends like the only problem with fossil fuels and biofuels is the carbon emissions. They want to pretend like all these other externalities don't exist. And the reality is the externalities are abound. And this is about perpetuating an industry that is poisoning our water from the fracking wells in the United States all the way to the transportation and combustion of these fossil fuels. And now they want to further that destruction on our communities with the development of new pipelines and storage infrastructure that will continue to wreak havoc on our communities. And this needs to stop.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, Mahmoud.
I would also like to add that the planned area of sequestration for the carbon dioxide in North Dakota is centered directly between the northern border of Standing Rock Reservation and the southern border of Fort Berthold Reservation. So it continues a long legacy of this country engaging in environmental racism. If any of these ill effects that Jim just mentioned were to actualize or become a problem for the local area, it would definitely affect Indigenous communities. And once again, they struggle with having limited resources and trying to manage their nation's affairs and being plagued with several issues and living in rural environments, not having access to, state-of-the-art or top-notch healthcare often and things like that. So these are all impacts and things of concern, in addition to the emergency response aspect that none of the tribes are really being informed as to the dangers or being outfitted with equipment or offered any type of specialized training. None of those discussions are being taken place. And they want to have this thing built out within 3 years, which again, we mentioned PHMSA won't even have regulations prepared until 3 years. So these are all big red flags for Indigenous nations. This is part of the reason why the Winnebago tribe has engaged the IUB in opposition and tried to formally submit an environmental impact study, in part for the sequestration underground. It also has something to do with Native Americans tied to the land, and that there is an entire ecological system living underground. What will happen if we start pumping thousands and thousands of metric tons of CO2 underground? We saw what happened with fracking, and it was too late. When they started doing all these injection wells down to Oklahoma, Texas, and so on, it created a lot of seismic activity. This is really a largely unproven technology. They've never done it on the scales that they're proposing for both of these pipelines. And, once again, they're putting the burden or the risk on communities of color that are ill adapted or ill prepared to fight back in meaningful ways because of lack of resources, a lot of other additional struggles going on in their communities, etc.
Thank you. I think that's just one of the most shocking things is that this is unproven, as Jim and Mahmoud both mentioned. The ability to store large amounts of CO2 underground for long periods of time. So we really don't know what will happen. Frederick, did you have one more thing to add?
Sorry, just to illustrate what Mahmoud just said, I encourage you to have a look at the cover of the report, which is a map prepared by Pipeline Fighters, which shows how close the pipeline is from reservations, but also from big cities. And it's really a concern because a lot of the discussions are about landowners where the pipeline is gonna go. So it's gonna go on your land, and there are discussions around eminent domain and so on. But there's a broader issue, which is the coverage and the size of such a pipeline and how close it gets to everybody. And these are Indigenous communities, these are urban communities as well, farm workers, everybody who is there. And this, we decided to put this map on the cover of the report because we found it was really striking to put this at scale to realize what we are talking about. I'll stop there. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Frederick. Unless there's anything else, I think we're just about out of time now. So yeah, just to conclude, as we've heard today, if the Midwest Carbon Express is built, residents across the Midwest will bear the risks associated with pipelines. This is potential leaks and ruptures, decreased property and crop values, while Summit Carbon Solutions, its wealthy investors, and Bruce Rastetter will reap the profits. Now, this courageous struggle to stop this pipeline should be a wake-up call to the Biden administration. Simply labeling a project a necessary investment to fight climate change does not fool communities who see these projects for exactly what they are. Policymakers instead must urgently scale the proven solutions to the climate crisis promoted by small farmers, indigenous groups, and other frontline communities. There's really no time left to waste on false solutions promoted by the same interests who have brought us to this catastrophe. That concludes today's press conference. Thank you all for joining us today. Again, the report is available on the Oakland Institute website, and there's some other resources there as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for joining. It was a pleasure to be here in company with you folks today.